Okay, so I'm going to give you a general overview today on compliance and all the things you should be doing. I'm going to be co-presenting with Phil Hayward, who is a barrister who practices at Doty Street Chambers. Doty Street Chambers are quite famous because they're currently representing Julian Assange hiding in an embassy somewhere in London. But, I myself am from a legal background. I'm a senior OIC advisor and a manager at Definitive, and I have 16 years experience as an immigration lawyer, so I'm a practicing solicitor. Essentially, a lot of my role involves going out to your companies and just checking that all your systems are up to date. So if there is an audit, hopefully I've spotted all the errors, etc. So I'm going to give you heads up on the areas you need to focus in today. So just a brief summary of our objectives. So essentially, I'm going to give a general overview on compliance and how to safeguard your Tier 2 sponsor licence. I myself will be covering the actual compliance visit. I will also be talking about the Home Office triggers, which might actually ignite a sort of unannounced visit to your office. I'm also going to talk about common areas in which sponsors actually fail the Home Office visit. Phil is then going to cover the Home Office action that can be taken against a sponsor who is found to be in breach of its sponsor licence obligations, and he's also then going to advise you on the judicial approach. So essentially, hopefully if you listen to me and you follow my tactics, then you won't ever have to speak to Phil, because if I introduce you to Phil at a later stage along the way when we're working with you, it means you obviously are already in trouble. So really, hopefully pay close attention to the points I'm going to give you. And here's Phil, he's my double axe. Right, so just a big overview. Okay, so, right, with regards to the compliance audit or visit, now, I love the word visit because if you look at the sponsor licence guidance, they sort of say, you will have a compliance visit or check, but I consider it to be actually an audit. So when you actually look at the guidance and they mention that, what they're actually going to be doing is coming in and literally pulling your systems apart and checking whether you are up to scratch. So essentially, the purpose of the visit is to ensure that processes are still being adhered to, and that all sponsors have an overriding duty to play their part in ensuring that the system is not abused. So apparently, when you guys signed up to a Tier 2 sponsor licence, that was your underwritten agreement, was to ensure that it wasn't. So clearly, when they come in, they're double checking that you're honouring that. So what they'll be looking at when they come into your offices are, first of all, your recruitment processes. What they're looking at is a very serious mixture of things, really. So they're looking at the RLMT. Do you all know what RLMT is, what it stands for? Yeah, it's the Resident Labour Market Test. And essentially, that's advertising. So if you've actually applied for a Tier 2 general visa and you have said you've advertised the role in X, Y, and Z locations, they're looking to see evidence of that, and you should have that still on file. Also, they're also looking at things like selection matrices used to ensure that you do have a selection process. So if you've actually gone on to hire a sort of migrant worker as opposed to a British or European, you have to justify your reasons for hiring that person. So again, they'll be pulling out random files and be looking at those sort of things to see that you're adhering to it. Yes, and CVs and adverts must be retained on file. Particularly, do you have the CVs? Sometimes, when you're hiring somebody, you might say it's because of X, Y, and Z. But if you can't explain why that candidate was the strongest candidate, you're going to have a problem. So definitely ensure you have all of your candidate CVs and files, particularly for the migrant worker that you've hired. Make sure you have that in the job description. The other thing that we're going to look at is the tracking and monitoring of migrant workers. Presumably, a lot of you will have a tracking system. That should involve making a note of when their visas are about to expire and also the type of visas that they have. You should also be making a clear note of the location of your workers. So, for example, if you've put on the certificate of sponsorship that Mr. X is based at Y location and they've moved to Z and you haven't notified UKDA, that could be an issue too. Likewise, any absences, which are sort of, they should be tracked as well, you should keep them on record. There should be a clear process in-house as to, who's keeping an eye on your staff. Particularly if they're off-site and they're working under various line managers, there must be a defined process. And likewise, contact details. Don't underestimate the importance of having up-to-date contact details. I've actually seen clients almost fail an audit just on that alone. And we've even had cases where people have failed audits on that. So when I say contact details, I mean things like the person's up-to-date address, their emergency contact details. It should be recorded on your systems and be up-to-date. And they may actually, in the audit, ask you to kind of randomly pull out a file, and they will check that you have that person's details on there. So do ensure, don't underestimate the importance of making sure that's up to date. The other thing that they'll look at when they pop in to see you would be the reporting processes. So you need to report to UKBA normally within 10 days of any changes to salary or location, for example, the employee. So again, they'll check that if you've got an employee working there and their salary's gone higher than 10% that year and you haven't reported it to UKBA, or the Home Office as they're now known as, then that would be an issue as well for failing to report. Likewise, if you've got any leavers, we should be letting the Home Office know. So again, they're looking out for these nitty-gritty things, which in essence you're doing, but if they find one file even amiss, that could be a concern. And the main thing is when you're reporting in time as well. I mean, I'd always say that even if you've forgotten to do it, definitely just report it anyway rather than not doing it at all. So log into the system and put the data in. We're here to assist you. We normally do reporting for you, so we'd help you. But again, make sure you reported it rather than not doing anything at all. And lastly, when they come in, they're looking at your record-keeping processes. So, how do you keep your files? Are they kept securely? Any worker files as a tip. And when they come in, they often ask us in the audit to be linked to where the files are, to be sure that not the entire office has access to it. So make sure they're all stored securely in a locked filing cabinet. Having a good process where you can say only a limited amount of people have access to that particular cabinet. And likewise, if you're having e-files, e-personal files, which are e-files, again, make sure they're securely protected with passwords, with again, only limited people having access to it. So again, that's quite important as well. And likewise, retaining passport copies is very important and BRPs, but make sure you're taking the correct copies. So often when I go in an audit, I see that someone's taken a copy of the visa, but they haven't taken a copy of the cover, they haven't taken a copy of other parts of the BRP file, or they've taken the copies and they haven't signed all the pages, so they all have to be signed and dated. And again, if after this talk you've got any questions, you feel free to drop us a line. I'm happy to kind of, guide you on it. So that's really what they're doing when they come in. And they'll spend a couple of hours going through the files, and they'll also talk to you about these processes, because they're also trying to check that you are definitely doing it and you're not making it up on the spot. So do you make sure that you, in a way, rehearse it before you come in. So will your visit be announced or unannounced? So I've got a go away sort of doormat there, because I have had a few clients where they've apparently turned up and they've said, no, don't come in, and that's definitely not a good start. If they do turn up unannounced, which is apparently their latest trend, because on an audit I went to last summer, the actual auditor said to me that her boss had said to her that from now on they're going to do it unannounced, because they thought sponsors were too ready for the audit. So if you haven't had one yet, you may have one in the next sort of 12 months where they'll just turn up on the doorstep. Really, the question mark will be the frequency of their visits. They're meant to give you one at the time when you're first applying for the licence, and the actual guidance says that any time during the duration of the licence they can come in. But what I loved in the actual guidance that I spotted the other day was it said they can come in at random times. So the key word here is random, that's the frequency of the visits. Now, a useful tip in getting ready, I would say that to have a look at who your key contact is on your sort of sponsor management system. If the key contact is one of you, number one, make sure that your contact details are up to date. I will actually always recommend that we're your key contact, because usually, if we are the key contact and they're going to do an announced visit, they will actually ring us up and say, hi, we're going to pop in and see, X company, and we will then use that time to try and stall them and sort of say, we need to speak to our client and get an agreed date. And usually that works, because we can drag it out by a few days and give you heads up that they're coming in. So I do recommend that. If you don't want to use this as your key contact, then make sure your details are 100% there. Because if they try to reach out to you and you're not there, that's also a breach as well. So, and following on to literally following on from that point, which is exactly the same point, do make sure that all of your email addresses are up to date. So if you have an authorising officer or a key contact and you've given an email address and they email that person, it bounces back, that could be a breach, because it means that you haven't told UKBA that the person's not there, and you'll be in quite a lot of trouble for it as well. Do make sure that you have the correct address on your sponsor licence. Recently, my colleague and I got asked to go and do a visit to check on a client, you know, their sponsor licence. So we were going to go to the address on the licence, only to find out the entire team was sitting somewhere completely different, at a location which hadn't been reported to the Home Office. So we had to tell that client to immediately go in and update the licence and put the new address, because again, if you have a team of officers turning up somewhere where you guys aren't, that's potentially breach and you can lose the licence for that. Also think about who should be present at the visit. So it doesn't have to be your authorising officer. Often I get asked from clients, does the AO have to be here? Usually I say no, because most AOs haven't got a clue what you guys are actually doing. So I'd say whoever's actually dealing with the migrant workers on a day-to-day basis, they should be there. Ideally, your level 1 contacts or level 1 users should be there as well. But agree a team in advance that if there is an audit, these are the people that be present. And likewise, if UKVA or the Home Office turn up unannounced, you are within your rights to say, look, our key people aren't here today, can you come back tomorrow, this is the person that will be seeing you. And that sounds much more organised and convincing than you're not running around shutting doors on them and panicking. So to make sure you have, you know, a sort of approach, you know, or even holiday cover as well, you've got somebody to back you up. And I'd also say, to get ready for an unannounced visit, I'd say maybe let some of your employees know that they may be called to a mini interview when the UKVA or the Home Office turn up. So essentially, they will ask them a bit about how they were hired, you know, what was the process, you know, especially if they're Tier 2 generals, they might ask how they were brought into the country, whether they did reply to the advert. So maybe think about some employees in advance that you will put forward. And make sure those files are pristine, because they'll have the files in front of them and they'll question them. So again, think about 2 to 3 employees that you would select in the event of an unannounced visit. Okay, so what are the triggers for a Home Office visit? So, okay, yes, they can come in randomly, yes, they can come in because you haven't had one for a couple of years, but there are actually sort of certain reasons why they do specifically come in, and I think it would be great to share it with you because I learned this recently. So, for example, they might receive specific intelligence about you, so that could be through HMRC, banks, it could be overseas embassies might say, hang on, these people are bringing X amount of people in, we're a bit concerned about the type of people coming in, or they could be looking at patterns of people being hired. Actual specific intelligence is one of the triggers for them to walk in and to start looking at your systems. Another thing could be specific intelligence about actual individuals working for you. So it could be that, you know, you've got somebody that's gone off on an actual sort of, you know, gone and made an application to, you know, and it's something completely relevant to you, and it's been brought up that, you know, you're doing X, Y, and Z, and I'll go into a bit more detail a bit later. And then also, if it's a change in law which puts you at higher risk, so for example, you know, hotels and restaurants have been flagged up as being more at risk, so they're doing more raids on them. Likewise with Tier 4 colleges, the same thing, they're doing more visits to them. So one of the things I would recommend would be that you need to pay close attention to anybody that might impact your licence. So effectively, when you have business visitors coming in, you know, if they're coming in, make sure that they're aware that they're coming in just as business visitors. I recently had a person from one of the companies I represent held up in an airport, and they said the wrong thing. They said, oh, I'm coming in to work at blah, blah, blah. And they weren't coming in to work, they were coming in as a visitor. And that could have actually led to intelligence to say, well, let's go and raid that company, because people are coming in under the pretext of being visitors, but they're actually here as workers. So really micromanage your business visitors, make sure they're carrying appropriate documents and letters, because that could, you know, protect you in many ways. Also think about your staff working on other sites. Do they have the correct visas and paperwork? They could be working on a client site, but if that client site is raided and they're there, it might again lead them to you. So if they have the wrong, you know, the wrong paper and visa. Likewise with ILR applications, settlement applications, that could also be a trigger for an audit, because usually at that point they will review the working practices. So for example, if you're having a work permit or a Tier 2 person applying for ILR, they need to provide evidence of their wages over the last few months. Now if there's any discrepancy in salaries, which is lower than that was in the cause, then that could lead to an investigation on you guys thinking, well, this person's not being paid X, Y, and Z. So don't think the ILRs are completely independent to you guys. You need to keep an eye on them and make sure that A, you're doing the letters in support, and B, just make sure they are being paid the correct salary with no sort of discrepancies. And as I said to you before, bounce emails, keep an eye on that, because that's always the easy way for them to work out that something's not quite happening right at that company. Okay, so just kind of as a kind of summary in relation to the areas in which I've seen people actually not pass the audit, so there was a massive fail sign there. It could be that you've done proper RLMT, you did it properly, but you just haven't kept the evidence on file, and it's not sufficient. So do make sure when you're doing advertising for Tier 2 generals, you have the adverts in the job centre, whichever website you're using, make sure that's all there. There could be no RLMT on file, that's the worst case scenario where it's lost or whatever, so just make sure that you do have it. So don't, it might be something that you're going to be asked to show in 2 years' time, but you need to make sure it's all safeguarded. It doesn't have to be in the specific client file itself or the worker's file, just make sure you have access to it and you can link it to your adverts and you have a reference that you can cross-refer. Likewise, your selection processes and your reasons for rejection of resident workers. If that's not clear, that's not going to do you any good. So do think about your matrices, your reasons for rejections. I've seen people get in trouble with the Home Office for sort of saying, the reason for rejection is not good enough or whatever. You have to make it really clear as to why, it has to be clear reasons which are really quite reasonable as to your reasons for rejecting particular workers, particularly when there's other good migrant British workers or EA workers applying who could have got jobs. So you need to really, I would say, zoom in on the skills and the qualifications and make that quite clear. As we've discussed, contact details are not up to date. That's a big reason for failing. And also, I think it's really important to have documented HR policies. So, for example, a clear policy on migrant tracking about who within your company is going to be in charge of policing, the migrant workers. Ensure you have one designated person or a team. I don't think it really works in an audit situation where you sit there and you say, well, X is doing it and Y is doing it, but you don't really have those people in the room. I think it's important to document it and make it very, very clear that you have a robust system and that you also have a clear system relating to visa expiry dates and how you're tracking it. It's not good enough just to log the expiry dates. You should be reviewing that table, at least 3 months in advance to see in advance when the visa is about to expire so you can take action. So think about the 3 months in advance rule, and then also think of a way of updating contact details. Now, I know a lot of you have your assignees updating it themselves. Some companies are quite bohemian approach. It's like you should really update it. I would sort of say you must update your contact details, and failure to do so could, would be an issue. Make that clear in your handbook. Look at your contact details and the processes when you go back, and make sure it's really robust. That the onus is upon them, and make it quite clear that that they can be in trouble for not doing it. Don't make it wishy-washy. Okay, so those are my reasons. Now, if you follow that, then you won't have to speak to Phil, because you won't be busted. If things do actually go wrong, then Phil's going to actually tell you the steps that I'm going to take.